It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the AOC AG273QCX. This monitor uses a 27-inch Samsung SVA panel, which has a 1800R curve and a 2560 by 1440 resolution. The curve, first off, it's something which is often exaggerated in videos and pictures of the monitor that you'll see, including this video of course, but when you're actually sitting in front of the monitor using it, it's really something that's quite natural. It just kind of draws you in a little bit more. It's actually quite subtle, and it's something which, once you've used the monitor for maybe a few hours or a few days, depending on how quickly you adapt, it's something which you just completely forget's there. It's sort of a nice little bonus, but it doesn't really dramatically change the experience, and there's a bit more about that in the written review. You'll find a link to the written review in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. The video review here, as usual, you have to remember that what you see depends on my camera, it depends on YouTube, my video editing software, and ultimately it depends on your own monitor. So what you see doesn't accurately represent what you'd see using the monitor firsthand. So coming on to the 2560 by 1440 or WQHD resolution, it offers you a good amount of desktop real estate, so you can do lots of multitasking, have plenty of useful information on the screen at once, browsing the internet, doing Word documents, whatever you happen to be doing. You can do lots of that at the same time. There's plenty of useful space. It also gives a good level of clarity to text, and the image clarity when you're looking at suitably high resolution content, including games, is good. The written review also explores a bit about the subpixels of this monitor, because on VA models in particular there can be some subpixel related issues which can affect the sharpness, particularly of text. But this model, it doesn't really have any issues related to that. It does have what I'd call relatively squat subpixels, which does introduce some static interlacing, and again that's explored in the written review, and I'm not going to spend my time exploring it here. It's something that most users won't notice, but the subpixels themselves, they're always fully illuminated when you're viewing text, and sort of thin lines and edges and stuff like that. So it doesn't have the issues that some VA models have, where there's an obvious cut in sharpness because of the subpixels. Another aspect which can affect the clarity is the screen surface, and it can certainly give a grainy look to the image when you're viewing lighter shades or white in particular. On this model there is a bit of graininess. It uses a light matte anti-glare screen surface, but the surface texture isn't as smooth as you'll see on some models, particularly VA models. They tend to be quite good in this respect. This model does have a bit of sort of what I call light misty graininess, but it doesn't have a heavy or smeary graininess, so I think most users will find it just fine in that respect. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. The monitor has a light matte anti-glare screen surface which offers good glare handling, and it has reasonable clarity and vibrancy maintained. Compared to some matte screens it's much better, not quite as good as some, but I explore that a bit more later on in the review, and I've mentioned it a little bit earlier as well. It has a curve to the screen, moderate curve, 1800R, and when you look at videos and pictures, the curve can look quite exaggerated, but when you actually use the monitor in person, it's something which you can adapt to quite readily, as I mentioned before. The stand base is a very solid design. It's not my favourite design, and that's not because it looks ugly in my opinion. Personally, I prefer stand bases to be a bit less of a desk space hog than this one, because it goes back quite far, so you can't put the screen quite as close to the wall as you might want. It's okay if you've got a very large desk, but it can be a little bit annoying. And also the screen is mounted quite close to the front, as you can see, pretty much in line with the front edge of the stand. There's a large matte black bezel at the bottom with a central red Aegon logo. The bezels at the top and sides, it has a three-side borderless design, and that means you've got a thin hard outer component of matte black plastic, and then there is a slender panel border which blends in quite readily when the screen is off, but you'll be able to see that when the screen is on. But even with both components considered, the bezels are quite thin. You'll also notice, if you see from certain angles, there's a kind of blue outline just around where the image will be, so sort of on the inside edge of the panel border. And this is completely normal, it's not a defect or anything. They're just calibration marks used by the machine that actually makes the panel and sandwiches everything together. But they're not really visible from a normal position. It's very faint. You have to have the light catching at the right angle to actually be able to see that. The OSD is controlled by a little joystick there. A separate video goes through that. There's also a little controller which you can attach, and this is also explored in the OSD video. This attaches using a reasonably long mini USB cable, so it gives you good flexibility to sort of put it pretty much wherever you want on your desk within reason, unless you've got a massive desk. The other aspect to note from the front is simply that the stand has a little cable tidy design, so you can slot your cables through there, and it's a bit neater than having them flailing around all over the place. I had mentioned earlier that the stand is a bit deeper than I would ideally like, but it is robust. It's a good solid design. It has powder coated metal, so it has a really nice premium feel to it, and it's very weighty, so it gives a really nice solid base to the monitor. It also offers a good amount of ergonomic flexibility. You can't pivot the monitor into portrait, and that's quite normal for curved monitors because they would look rather weird in portrait, and really the curve is designed to be viewed in landscape orientation. But you can adjust the height of the monitor, and if you have it all the way down, you'll see there's a little bit of the carrying handle on the top of the stand neck, which you can see, and I'll show you that from the back a bit more clearly, but that kind of pokes out a bit at the top. And the bottom stand height, there's exact measurements in the written review, but as you can see, it doesn't really go very close to the desk itself, so just be aware it's not the most compact design overall. And you can, of course, raise the stand height a fair bit if you like. You can also tilt the screen backwards and forwards slightly, and you can swivel it left and right. So it has a turntable mechanism built into the top of the stand base there. At the side you can see the interesting shape of the stand. It is a robust stand, as I mentioned before, powder coated metal also used on the stand neck itself. There's matte black plastic at the front where it actually attaches, but the screen itself is reasonably thin at the thinnest point, but it lumps out centrally where the stand attaches. The other thing to note from the side is that there are retractable headphone hooks. There's one on either side, and I'll show you that when I look at the rear of the monitor because it's a bit clearer from that angle. From the rear, you can see that the monitor is mainly matte black plastic. There's a red Aegon logo in the top central region, and of course there is the powder coated metal, sort of light grey colour of the stand. And there's also a ring around the stand attachment point, and that looks a kind of slightly shiny light grey usually, but it does actually house the lighting effects feature, and that's explored in the OSD video. There are also integrated speakers, again explored in the OSD video, which give reasonably rich and full sound output, certainly as far as integrated speakers go, and these are placed internally and the grills for them are at the side. The stand attaches using a proprietary mechanism, but you can see the little catch there, and that will release the screen from the stand, and you can attach an alternative 100 by 100mm VESA solution. In the box you'll find some little standoffs to help you actually get the right leverage for those screws, because the stand attachment point is kind of quite far into the screen itself, if that makes sense. So you can't just have a sort of flat mount and expect that to work, so there are some adapters included with the screen. There's a Kensington lock slot just there, and as I mentioned, there are some retractable headphone hooks either side, so you can choose which side you put your headphones on, and they work just fine. I use them myself sometimes, although for some reason I sort of, when I'm actually using the monitor, even if I'm not using my headphones, I prefer not to have them sort of hanging in front of my face, but that's just a personal preference I have. The ports are down firing. You can see to the left there is a 3.5mm microphone jack, which is that little pink one there. Next to that, a 3.5mm headphone jack. There are 4 USB 3 downstream ports, and you can see one of them is coloured yellow, and it has a little lightning icon next to that, and that means it supports fast charging. There's then a USB 3 upstream, and there's a power connector, and that's an AC power connector, so the monitor has an internal power converter. It doesn't have an external power brick. The other side, There are two HDMI 2 ports, and they support the full capabilities of the monitor, including HDR, including 144Hz at 2560 by 1440, and AMD FreeSync 2. There is then two DisplayPort 1.4s, and these support the full capability of the monitor as well, and you can also use adaptive sync as an NVIDIA user with some caveats, as I'll explore later. D-Sub, or VGA, the analog connection of the monitor, certainly doesn't support the full capabilities of the monitor, but it's there for compatibility with much older systems. There's a 3.5mm audio input, a 3.5mm microphone jack, and the last one there is a little mini USB, and that's where the controller attaches, if you want to use that. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to be talking about the contrast performance of the monitor. As a VA panel, the contrast is one of the main strengths. It has around 3000 to 1 static contrast, actually measured slightly more than that, even following the adjustments made to my test settings. So it's certainly stronger than you'd get from a non-VA LCD panel under SDR, as I'm viewing right now. So what that means is the depth of dark shades is much better, so that creates a better atmosphere on games like this, where there are plenty of dark scenes, dark areas with dimly lit tombs and passageways and stuff like that. So it creates a better atmosphere. It doesn't mean that you can view the monitor in a dark room as I am now and expect the dark shades to look really deep and inky. It doesn't really work like that, because 3000 to 1 contrast isn't exactly exceptional in that respect. But what it does do is, regardless of lighting, it gives you an edge compared to other LCD panel types. Lighter shades stand out nicely against the darker surroundings. The fire there, for example, and the light streaming in from outside, it all stands out nicely against darker surroundings. And it has a little bit of graininess from the screen surface, as I mentioned before, when you're observing brighter shades like this, but it's not extreme. It's certainly not heavy or smeary graininess which some models provide with matte screen surfaces, so that's good to avoid. As a VA panel, there are some weaknesses in terms of the contrast performance. One of them is so-called VA glow, and you can see that on the video. It's actually exaggerated in the video, but it's most prominent from a normal viewing position towards the bottom of the monitor, and it sort of eats away at some of the detail and it lightens up the shades. You can also have a bit of backlight bleed, which can kind of exaggerate this effect. My unit does have a little bit of backlight bleed in places. Again, it is exaggerated in the video, but this does affect the atmosphere a bit. The VA glow on this model, though, it's not really as extreme as I've seen on some models. It's better than the Samsung C27 AG273 I've reviewed. It's not as good as some of the best models in that respect, such as the BenQ EW277 HDR. It's not a feature that affects the atmosphere anywhere near as much as IPS glow would. And again, to stress, it is sort of exaggerated in the video, and I've positioned the camera to try and better replicate what your eyes would see from a normal viewing position as well. I should mention though, my observations around VA glow, I'm mainly talking about my normal viewing position, which is around 70 to 80 centimeters from the screen if I can get my eyes that far away. As I mentioned, the stand design's kind of deep, so sometimes it can be hard to sit as far away as you might like from the monitor. But if you sit closer, the VA glow does intensify and becomes more of a feature. And if you happen to be viewing it from off angle, it really sort of blooms out more noticeably. But it's never really as noticeable as IPS glow. And also being a VA panel, you don't get that kind of shift in gamma, which you get vertically on TN panels, which can sort of wash out and flood the bottom of the monitor and make things look far too masked higher up. So the actual overall detail levels are good. There is something else which affects them though. It's called black crush, and that's whereby dark shades, lighter than black but still very dark, essentially appear darker than they should when viewed from a normal viewing position, particularly in the central region of the monitor. And that can mask some of the subtle detail in dark scenes like this. But on this model, it's not too extreme. I've certainly seen more black crush on some VA models. But if you move off angle, you'll see the detail levels change considerably. This is again exaggerated a bit on the video, and actually when you're viewing from that kind of angle there's excessive detail, the perceived gamma is too high, but you will notice some differences in detail levels when you're comparing the centre of the screen versus viewing the same shades further out. But again, the detail levels are good overall. Even with the black crush, you don't get the kind of issues I mentioned with the TN models with the perceived gamma shifts. And on this title that's useful because certain rocks have a porous texture, which means they're climbable, so it's kind of a little cue for you to say that you can jump onto the rocks, clamber onto them, use your climbing gear and climb them. On TN models, especially of this size, you tend to find that that kind of detail is completely masked at the top of the screen and you can't see it at all, and that can be really annoying. On this model, even in the central region, you can always see that surface texture of the rocks, although again it can be fainter than it should be because of the black crush. This model doesn't have issues with excessive detail though. Some models, it's more TN models are prone to this, but certainly you can have other panel types depending on the gamma and general shade handling. It doesn't have issues with blockiness or banding or that kind of thing from excessive detail being revealed, so that'll certainly please some users. I'm now going to talk about colour reproduction, and I'd like to start this section off by looking at the Lagom, that's lagom.nl, the website. The Lagom text test is a very good way of seeing if there are any viewing angle related issues to the gamma curve of the monitor, so if it's influenced heavily by that. As a VA panel, there is certainly a moderate amount of influence in that respect. So text, it should look a blended grey ideally throughout the screen, but what you actually see are some shifts, especially as you shift your head, but even just from a normal viewing position, you see a kind of area which is a bit more blended towards the middle of the screen, and around that you see some changes in terms of the text appearing with a kind of green tint and red tint depending on which area of the screen you're looking at. And the sort of cone in the middle where the perceived gamma is different, that's again the thing that causes the black crush which I mentioned before, these differences in perceived gamma. But perhaps more useful or relatable in the real world would be looking at a solid shade. For example, the purple block, it should appear a sort of bluish purple throughout. It appears sort of mostly that, but there is a stronger pink tint in some places, and the pink hue kind of shifts around as you move your head as well. And as with the VA glow, this is more exaggerated if you are closer to the monitor. These shifts are more pronounced. But compared to what you see on a TN model, looking at this kind of thing, and you can reference my videos, you'll see that you don't get that kind of gradient from top to bottom. It's more of a kind of weakening of saturation and some shifts in the tone, sort of a bit of a duller look towards the flanks and the bottom in particular from a normal viewing position. The red block is actually a bit more consistent, but again you can see some loss of saturation. It looks a bit more of a kind of faded red towards the bottom and a bit towards the sides as well. And again, if you move your head, this kind of shifts. You can see some shifts in terms of red, pink, shifting between the two. The green block, it's fairly consistent, quite a vibrant looking green, a bit deeper than on some models because of the colour gamut, which I'll come on to shortly. It looks a little bit more yellow towards the bottom. The blue block, it's as usual a good consistent deep blue. But these are just some shades of course, and you don't generally look at complete blocks of colour on the screen, so I'll be looking at in-game examples as well. I'm on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction using some in-game examples instead. The monitor has a vibrant look overall. That's certainly the first thing most people will think of when they look at the colours on this. They do stand out nicely, and a large part of that is the colour gamut. It extends comfortably beyond sRGB, and it offers actually quite decent coverage of the DCI-P3 colour space. I believe around 90% is specified, and according to my measurements, I think that's perfectly believable. So what that means is when you're looking at normal SDR content like this, which is designed for the sRGB colour space, things do look more saturated than they should, and that does give a vibrant look, a vivid look, but it doesn't give a kind of cartoonish look. On some traditional wide gamut monitors, particularly those that track closely to the Adobe RGB colour space, that has a lot of skew in the colours, and that's because the colour gamut is extended massively in the green region, less so in red and blue. In fact, it corresponds with sRGB in red and blue. So that gives a skew to the shades. It doesn't just mean that greens are oversaturated, it actually pulls shades in a weird way and makes them look cartoonish and odd. If you have an absolutely gigantic colour gamut as well, it can make things look very strongly saturated and a bit odd for that reason. This model, as I said, sort of moderate oversaturation. Most users will just see this as looking vibrant. And another thing to note is it's not like digital saturation enhancement where you're just pulling shades closer to the edge of the colour gamut, which does of course increase saturation without actually adjusting the colour gamut itself. So if you do that, you actually just lose shade variety and you don't gain any shades that are more saturated than the edge of the colour gamut because you're not expanding that. On this model you are expanding the colour gamut. Shades maintain proper spacing on the gamut, so they don't have that kind of strange compressed look either. So there's a really nice variety of earthy browns, red tones, autumnal reds and browns, lots of golden greens and oranges, a really nice variety of shades, and some good rich greens as well. Maybe not so much here, perhaps the grass there, you might call that quite a rich green. But certainly on this game, more generally, there are some examples of really quite nice vibrant shades, but also plenty of more muted pastel shades as well. As I mentioned with Lagom, there are some shifts in terms of the saturation weakening a bit lower down and towards the edge of the screen, but even there it doesn't really look washed out at all from a normal viewing position, and these shifts are actually relatively minor. And again, because you're not looking at solid shades, solid blocks of colour, these shifts are really sort of quite easy to ignore when you're just gaming. But these shifts in tone, and they are more exaggerated for some shades, and actually some of the pastel shades tend to show this more readily. So if you're doing colour critical work, IPS type models are better for that reason. They are more consistent and you can sort of be assured that what you get in the centre of the screen is more or less the shade you're going to get towards the edge. Whereas on this model, there's sort of more shade shift in terms of the saturation and gamma than you'd see on your typical IPS model. But as I said, nice and rich from a normal viewing position. So when I'm referring to a normal viewing position, in my case that's about 70 to 80 centimeters from the screen, head fairly central, actually a bit higher than central because that's the ergonomically correct viewing position. But if you are sitting closer, these shifts and the loss of saturation lower down and towards the edges become more pronounced. And if you're sitting off angle as well, you can see that even on the video quite readily. It's partly because there's a bit of reflection of ambient light, but the shades certainly reduce in saturation. And I've actually had some people come to me with VA models and they're saying, oh, they just don't look as vibrant as you've said. You said in your review they look vibrant, but I just don't see that. And upon further investigation, it's because they actually are sitting at strange angles relative to the screen. So they're not sitting at a desk looking at it normally. They're actually standing above it, or they're lying on their bed looking up at it. And if you're doing that, then IPS models will generally give you a much better performance because there are shifts in saturation as you move off angle. But as I mentioned, from a normal viewing position, they're not extreme. But for colour critical work, do be aware of them. I'm now running the game in HDR, and it does take a new lease of life when you're actually looking at it in terms of the graphics. They're very different regardless of what settings you use outside of HDR. So this monitor does support HDR. It supports VESA Display HDR 400, which is actually the lowest level of HDR which VESA will certify for. But it does bring some advantages. One of the advantages is that the colour gamut, which as I've mentioned is fairly close to DCI-P3, that is used more effectively in HDR because the game, rather than the game being sort of written with sRGB in mind, the near-term target is DCI-P3 or good coverage of the DCI-P3 colour space, so the game developers can actually use that gamut more effectively. What that means is some shades appear less saturated than under SDR, and that's fine because they should look less saturated. For example, some of the sort of earthy browns look more neutral and less reddish, although this model does sort of push the saturation a bit under HDR, so there's a bit of oversaturation, but it's quite a slight amount in comparison to under SDR, and it's sort of the look that most users will like because it's nice and vibrant. If you look at the wood on the rifle of these soldiers, for example, I can see that there is sort of, again, a less of a red hue, but there is a bit of a kind of orangey red appearance, which perhaps ideally wouldn't be there. But with this extended gamut, some of the shades which the developers really want to stand out, like fires and stuff like that, this glowing fire there really stands out beautifully with some really deep shades, some lovely deep oranges and yellows, and a really nice variety of shades. The other aspect of HDR, which this monitor certainly does just fine, is that it offers 10-bit colour reproduction. So the game developers use greater precision with the tone mapping and shade mapping, and this means that there are sort of smoother gradients when you're looking at fog, smoke and that kind of thing, and rays from the sun. Everything just has a really nice smooth transition, and there's sort of a nicer variety of shades. So this monitor does that very nicely indeed. It does use dithering, but that's completely normal actually. The vast majority of monitors under HDR or not will use dithering at some point. So it does certainly have a different look to HDR, and this level of precision is very noticeable when you're looking at shade details. It's perhaps not so noticeable here. This isn't perhaps the best scene to show it, but certainly the level of detail in the shaded areas is better. There's sort of a better distinction between various different closely matching shades, and it does just sort of look more realistic in that respect. But the other aspect of HDR, contrast, and I'll come on to this more by looking at Tomb Raider because I'd like to show you some other examples of HDR in action. This monitor doesn't offer any local dimming. It doesn't have a full array local dimming backlight. It doesn't have any local dimming, in fact, on the backlight. So what that means is you don't get any advantage in contrast from enabling HDR. What happens is the peak luminance is increased, and there are specific measurements for contrast, luminance, all of that in the written review, so definitely reference that. But what you'll notice is things just look brighter overall, but it also drags the luminance of these darker shades up, because if you had local dimming or per pixel illumination in an ideal world, you'd see those much darker shades, like the sort of the tire there, for example, appearing really deep and dark, whereas the rest of it would look really bright and sort of catch the eye. So you don't get that. Also, the peak luminance is under 500 candles per meter squared, and given that, and coupled with the fact that the darker shades aren't as deep as they should be, you don't really get that kind of standout pop that you get on some HDR models. But that's something which you won't get with any VESA Display HDR 400 compatible display anyway. It's something which requires local dimming, and it requires a more powerful backlight. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm running it under HDR. And one thing I didn't really mention before was that the university high brightness, rather than having localized bright areas and lots of shades actually appearing quite dark, it can be a bit uncomfortable, especially if you're sitting in a darker room. I'd recommend frequent breaks. I mean, regardless of whether you're running HDR or not. I know that's easy to say, and what you say and what you do isn't always the same thing. But when I was using this monitor under HDR, I did find that I needed to take more frequent breaks, and my eyes sort of felt fatigued more easily. And I wouldn't really want to use HDR on this monitor for too long at once. And I would say that this applies to any VESA Display HDR 400 level display, and actually really any display under HDR. It can be more fatiguing to your visual system, so just be aware of that aspect. Under HDR, other than HDR, exactly the same graphic settings are being used. The game really does have a very different look, and in many respects a more realistic look in terms of the sort of nuanced variety of shades. The handling of those rays there, for example, around the sun. This won't come across properly on the video because you're not seeing HDR on the video, and it's not possible to capture this on the video and let you see it exactly as you'd see it. But the rays of the sun and the very subtle differences in the gradients are really beautifully handled here. There are also little nuances of shade differences with the greens there, and particularly the shadow detail. Just gives a nicer, more defined look. But there are some, speaking of the shadow detail, like the shadow detail in the rocks there and between the plants, it just isn't as deep as it should be. Those little details should be much darker than they are. And this is a daylight scene predominantly, so it doesn't really sort of look particularly off because of this. And the sun there should also look brighter than it does. It should really stand out with amazing pop, because that's what a true HDR experience delivers. But that's not really what you get here. I'm now on a much darker scene, or a scene which has much darker elements, and really they look completely flooded. They don't have the kind of depth that they should have on a proper HDR display. And by this, I mean I'm talking about a tiny minority of displays with very effective local dimming, things which generally don't even exist these days. You would get a much greater depth to those dark areas. On this, they look clearly flooded and really much brighter than they should, particularly if you're observing in a darker room like I am now. There's also the strange kind of flickering. The backlight doesn't seem to know what it's doing. It's sort of shifting between dimmer and brighter positions, as it is basically a dynamic contrast mode across the whole screen. I didn't really notice this at all when I was playing in environments which were predominantly brighter shades, but this is a bit peculiar, and I didn't really notice this much on Battlefield 5. I'm not entirely sure what's going on here, but you know, it is what it is. I would say that if you're going to be using HDR and you're playing games with lots of dark scenes, you might want to reconsider using HDR on this model, or at least make sure the room is brighter, because in a dark room like this, it's just not an attractive thing. I've now got more sensible lighting conditions in the room, and you can see a lack of depth still, but it's not as noticeable as it was in the dark room. But even so, it's not really ideal, and I think generally for predominantly dark scenes, the HDR performance really is quite poor on any VESA Display HDR 400 level display, and that includes this one. And I can see frequent flickering as well. You'll be able to see that on the camera, no doubt. It's odd, I'm not really sure exactly what's causing it. I think it's just the backlight sort of rapidly fluctuating, because it can't really decide whether it wants to go brighter or dimmer. You can use adaptive sync with HDR on this monitor. It is FreeSync 2 compatible, and you can enable adaptive sync and use HDR at the same time. There are also various different HDR operating modes. I'm just going to go through them quickly. I've got them set up just as the defaults now, but if you go on the luminance menu under HDR, you'll see you can't really edit much at all, and you can't really customize the settings much, and that's quite normal for HDR. The monitor sort of tightly controls things there. But you will see there are these eco modes on the luminance menu. There's HDR, which is the default. There's HDR picture, HDR movie, and HDR game. The HDR picture, movie, and game settings, I don't like them at all because they greatly oversaturate the image. And unfortunately, this is the digital saturation enhancement, if you want to call it that, which gives the issues with the crushed shade variety that I mentioned before. And it just makes everything sort of look quite cartoonish and just completely wrong, to be honest. And with a monitor with this kind of generous colour gamut, you really don't need that kind of assistance. In fact, it's much better not to have that. The other aspect is these three modes also have this strange over-sharpening effect, this very strong sharpness filter attached to them. The HDR picture mode actually is not as saturated as the other two, but it does have some underlying oversaturation in places, and it does have this strange sharpness filter. It's not always so noticeable, and in this particular scene it's not actually that bad, but in some scenes it really is noticeable. Extra sharpness is used in HDR sometimes to help sort of define the enhanced contrast and really exaggerate that effect, and it can actually work quite nicely. But on VESA Display HDR 400 level displays, and as they've implemented on this monitor, it really is just excessive sharpness, and I much prefer not having that. Be aware that if you have changed from HDR to one of the other settings, HDR, picture, movie or game, and you then go back to HDR, you're unfortunately left with this sharpness filter until you deactivate and then reactivate HDR. So if you like how things look by default but would like that extra sharpness filter, then by all means do this. But if you want it disabled, you'll have to disable HDR again and make sure you don't touch any of those settings. If you want to disable HDR, you can do it in the game, or disable and re-enable it. You can do it in the game, or you can do it in image setup, HDR, turn it off, and then back to auto again, so that'll reactivate it and I'll get rid of the sharpness filter. So yeah, that's really all there is to the HDR performance. As you can see, it works quite nicely, and some users will like the look in brighter scenes, but for darker scenes and for more mixed content, it really is far from ideal. I'm now on Battlefield 5 again, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. There's a very important concept to understand called perceived blur. This is explored in the written review, and it's also explored in some detail in an article all about responsiveness on our website. Basically, when it comes to perceived blur on a monitor, there are two main contributors. One of them is the movement of your own eyes as you track motion on the screen. And this is something which is greatly reduced if your frame rate and refresh rate is increased. So this is a 144Hz monitor, and it's running at around 144 frames a second at the moment. There are a few dips. You can see the frame rate in the top right, but for the most part I'm making the most out of the monitor because I'm getting the highest possible frame rates. And in terms of the perceived blur, in this respect, because of the high refresh rate and frame rate, it's quite good. There's quite a low level, especially when you compare it to a 60Hz monitor. There are some weaknesses, and that's because pixel responses also contribute to perceived blur, and weaknesses there add to perceived blur, and I'll come on to that shortly. The other aspect though, related to the refresh rate and the high frame rate, is that the monitor is outputting more information every second to the user, and this enhances the connected feel. So when I refer to connected feel, it's the precision, the fluidity that you feel when you're interacting with the monitor. Input lag is of course one aspect of this, but regardless of how low input lag is, if you're on a 60Hz monitor, there's a definite lack of connected feel compared to running at 144Hz at a suitably high frame rate, as I am now. So the interactions with the game world are just a lot more fluid. It's something which you really have to sort of feel yourself to appreciate, but people who are sensitive to this kind of thing and who have used high refresh rate monitors at high frame rates will know what I'm talking about here. The input lag, as I'd mentioned, does influence the connected feel, and on this monitor it's fairly low. It's not super low, but I recorded around 6 milliseconds, and that includes an element of pixel response time as well as the signal delay. The signal delay being the element of input lag that you feel. So basically the signal delay is pretty low. So coming on to the pixel responsiveness, that's of course a very important aspect to consider, especially on VA models like this, because they are known to have weaknesses in terms of pixel responsiveness. This model is certainly no exception in that regard. Most of the transitions in this scene, which is why I'm using this scene at the moment, are medium or lighter shades, and the monitor performs those transitions quite quickly, and some of them are really good enough to make pretty much optimal use of the 144Hz refresh rate and high frame rates. Other ones, there's a little bit of powdery trailing, and that sort of adds a bit to perceived blur, a little bit of a mask of perceived blur in addition to what you'd ideally see, but it's not extreme for the most part for these kind of transitions. There are some higher contrast transitions here. I'm going to focus on them on another scene where they're a bit more widespread and so it's more obvious. But you can see the soldiers here, for example, there's what I call breakup trailing. So there are some shades such as dark purples and dark greens which sort of appear to leach out behind the characters as I'm moving. You might be able to see this on the video. There's a kind of sort of a purple hue around the helmet there, for example. So this is what I refer to as breakup trailing. It's a bit like when you're wetting water-soluble ink on a page and it kind of runs a bit with the water. That's the kind of effect you've got here. And I will show you some more specific examples of this. Just before moving on to the more specific examples of these high contrast transitions and the sort of main weaknesses on this model, I should mention I'm using the strongest overdrive setting available on the monitor, and that is having the overdrive set to strong. Now with this setting, there is a little bit of overshoot in places. For example, you can see it around some of these trees with the lighter sky in the background. It might not come across on the video because it's not exactly the strongest overshoot, which is a good thing obviously, but you can see the overshoot inverse ghosting behind the tree there. There's sort of a little bit of what I call a snail slime trail, because it has a kind of semi-transparent look and it's sort of brighter than the background colour and the object colour, so it stands out for that reason a bit. And there's also some sort of what I call dirty trailing in places where it's a bit darker than the background or the object colour. But there's nothing extreme at 144Hz or so. If you are sensitive to overshoot and you happen to want to reduce that, you could reduce the overdrive setting. Medium doesn't really do an awful lot, to be honest. It's not massively different to strong. It gives you slightly more powdery trailing. The weak setting is perhaps one to try if you are particularly sensitive to overshoot, because now it's pretty much disappeared. but instead of that you get an increase of powdery trailing and therefore an increase in perceived blur. So for me personally, I prefer the overshoot, but everyone might have their own sort of opinion on that, so feel free to experiment with the other settings yourself. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 5, and this has plenty of high contrast transitions, and it's really sort of good for highlighting the weaknesses on this model. So around the canoes here, for example, you'll be able to see this breakup trailing as I mentioned before, and trailing which has rather a smeary quality to it. You can see, especially if you circle the mouse, there's a sort of, it looks like ink is running off the page, that kind of look which I was describing earlier. So these are really caused by much slower than optimal pixel transitions. Again, I'm running at around 144 frames a second where possible, so these are weaknesses which are present regardless of how high your frame rate may be. And they are also present at lower frame rates, although there's some adjustments to the pixel overdrive which I'll come on to when I talk about FreeSync shortly. So the flag here has some what I call heavy powdery trailing. It's not really smeary, but it certainly increases perceived blur and it has a sort of a powder behind it. May not come across on the video, but you can definitely see it by eye. And some more sort of smeary and breakup trailing here around the tree trunk and that flag there. So especially if you move the mouse fairly rapidly, you can really see that come into effect. And there's some more sort of examples here. I mean, you get the idea, and in fact there's really a very smeary quality to the trailing around here. Now these, okay, there's some more smeary trailing here. I mean, yeah, you get the idea. These high contrast transitions, and all VA models have some weaknesses here to various degrees. Now this isn't anything to do with the overdrive setting, because I've got that set to strong as I mentioned. If you weaken that off, say to weak, it doesn't really actually change these transitions much. They're there all the same. They're not exactly stronger, to be honest. Perhaps they're a bit more obvious, but really things appear much the same. It's more the medium and light shades which the pixel overdrive affects, and in a positive way, because it speeds them up when you select strong. But the overdrive doesn't have any positive effect on these particular transitions. I've ramped up the graphics settings a bit, and that's because I'm going to talk about adaptive sync on this monitor. This monitor supports adaptive sync, and that means if you've got a compatible AMD GPU or system, you can use FreeSync, or more specifically FreeSync 2, because this monitor also has HDR compatibility. Now, with FreeSync active, where you get those departures from the refresh rate with your frame rate, so we can see top right corner, again, the frame rate, it's sort of around 100 frames a second. It's certainly a lot lower than 144, and it is not a consistent 144. So if you have FreeSync disabled and you've got VSync enabled, you'd get obvious stuttering with these sort of frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. Whereas if you've got FreeSync disabled and VSync disabled, you'd get obvious tearing instead. Now when I say obvious tearing or stuttering when you've got FreeSync disabled, individual sensitivity to that does vary, but to users like me who are sensitive to this, it's really very nice not having that as an issue. There are some penalties to this reduction in frame rate though. For one thing, there's increased overshoot, so you can see that around the flagpole here, or hopefully you can see that in the video. There's more obvious overshoot. Before that, I mean, there's sort of smeary trailing as well, that breakup trailing a bit, but it's largely replaced by overshoot, and that ideally wouldn't be there. And I am using the strong setting. What I would say is if you're sensitive to overshoot and you're frequently having these dips in frame rate, perhaps you're in the double digits because this does get stronger as the frame rate decreases further, you might want to try using the weak setting for the overdrive, because that gets rid of the overshoot, although it does increase this sort of breakup trailing and the smeary appearance to trailing. And there's still some overshoot in places, but not as much. Now, NVIDIA G-Sync models, they use what's called variable overdrive, and this is very rarely used with FreeSync models. And what that means is that as your frame rate decreases and your refresh rate therefore decreases as well, the pixel overdrive retunes itself because the voltage requirements at 144 Hz are very different to lower frame rates when it comes to pixel overdrive. So FreeSync models where they're sort of optimized for 144 Hz, and as the refresh rate drops below that, you just get an increase in overshoot and things aren't really rebalanced as they would be on an NVIDIA G-Sync model. If you have FreeSync disabled and you've got these lower frame rates, then you don't get this increase in overshoot, and that's because the refresh rate itself is really what determines this, and that's still 144 Hz if you've got FreeSync disabled. The other aspect to remember is that you've got a lower frame rate now, and that does increase the overall perceived blur, and it decreases the connected feel. So if you compare 100 frames a second to 144, sensitive users such as myself can certainly feel and see a difference there. I've increased various graphics settings. I'm now close to 60 frames a second. You can see here 68 frames a second or so. The overshoot's increased further. Again, I'm not really sure if that'll come across on the video, but to the eye it's quite eye-catching now, and that's ideally wouldn't be there. But as I said, there's not variable overdrive as typical for FreeSync models. On some FreeSync monitors, as you're at these sort of much lower frame rates, the overshoot becomes extremely obvious, really in your face. On this model it's not so bad, but it certainly is more noticeable as your frame rate decreases. I've made some further changes. I've increased the graphics further, and my frame rate now dips below 40 frames a second sometimes. As I'd mentioned, this monitor has a 48 to 144 Hz variable refresh rate range, but it does support LFC, low frame rate compensation, and this gets rid of frame rate and refresh. This gets rid of frame rate and refresh rate mismatches by ensuring that the monitor itself is keeping to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate. So if I put the monitor's FPS counter on, which is actually a refresh rate indicator, I'll put that on the top left. You'll see that says 100 or 99, whereas the frame rate itself is half of that. And that's because, obviously it fluctuates as the frame rate fluctuates, but that does not match that, and that's because it's keeping to a multiple, it's using LFC, and that does keep stuttering and tearing at bay. One thing I would mention is when it does activate, there is a momentary stuttering, and that's just when it activates or deactivates. So if you're not frequently crossing that boundary, I wouldn't worry about that. There is one slight issue with FreeSync which I haven't mentioned yet, and that is flickering. Now, on VA models, I've had quite a lot of users report this, and I've seen it myself sometimes, but on this model it's a bit more obvious than I've seen before, the flickering. It mainly occurs when you're in a menu, or there's sort of a very low frame rate, or if there's a sudden fluctuation in frame rate. So there's a drop by, say, 40 frames a second. It doesn't just happen when there are fluctuations in frame rate though. I mean, I've found some instances of certain frame rates where it sort of flickers a bit, and it's difficult to pinpoint exactly why. But for the most part, I didn't find it too annoying, certainly not on this title. But I do play Fallout 76 as well, and there are some huge fluctuations in frame rate, and the flickering there was really quite intense. This monitor is also NVIDIA G-Sync compatible, so that means if you are using a compatible NVIDIA GPU, so that's GTX 10 series or above, and it will support NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, you can use adaptive sync on the monitor. So you set it up exactly the same way, enable FreeSync in the OSD, and you can use the adaptive sync on the monitor, G-Sync compatible mode. That works in roughly the same way. I mean, it gets rid of tearing and stuttering, but there are some differences. One difference is that the floor of operation for NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode on this monitor is 60 Hz, but below that it will use a low frame rate compensation like technology to keep tearing and stuttering at bay. One particular issue I had with NVIDIA's implementation on this monitor, or this monitor with NVIDIA's implementation, whichever way you want to look at it, the flickering I mentioned before, it was a lot more widespread, and I noticed this across a huge range of frame rates, including in the triple digits, and this really became quite bothersome. So bothersome in fact that I actually didn't enjoy using the technology very much. So although it works, if you are sensitive to flickering, it's sort of best to keep it disabled as an NVIDIA user. And whilst I've been recording this, I have noticed some more flickering. It's sort of momentary, but I saw that the frame rate dipped at sort of 30 or 40 frames a second every now and then there was a little bit of flickering. But on the NVIDIA GPU, it was quite constant. At some frame rates, it could have been 80 frames a second or so, 120 or so, 130 or so. There are some instances of flickering there, and it was really quite annoying. Another thing I noticed is that the overdrive control didn't work when I was using my NVIDIA GPU with the G-Sync compatible mode in. So it was stuck on off no matter what you were using, so you couldn't use this strong setting, it didn't do anything, so you got way more widespread powdery trailing, and that was quite annoying as well. To wrap up then, in terms of the design of the monitor, I quite like it. I like the way the stand is powder coated metal, it's very solid, nice and heavy, has a good heft to it. It's firmly plants the monitor on the desk, but personally I prefer shallower stand designs, so you can put the monitor close to the wall. The shape of the stand is also quite unique, quite unusual, I guess, which some users are like, some users won't like so much. But I mean, you can VESA mount it if you prefer and use your own solution instead. The curve of the screen, it's, to be honest, something which at this point in the review I've largely forgotten is even there. It's really a subtle effect, slightly extra depth, but it doesn't bother me at all, and most users will adapt to this just fine. The screen surface, light matte anti-glare, although a little bit grainy than I personally would like, although not really particularly bad in that respect. And certainly if you compare to the AOC AG273QCX, the G-Sync model with the TN panel, that has a way grainier screen surface. In terms of contrast performance, that's really the main strength of this monitor and the main strength of any VA panel. But this model has static contrast which was better than on the Samsung C27 HD70, which I looked at. So it was close to 3000 to 1 even after adjustments, and that gave a much better depth and atmosphere to dark scenes in games, movies, whatever else, than TN or IPS models would do, or even some VA models with weaker contrast than this. There was some VA glow towards the bottom of the screen, not a huge amount, not an extreme amount, slightly less than on the Samsung. I've seen models certainly with less of this as well, like the BenQ EW277HDR that I looked at. That has a bit less than this. Overall though, not a big issue. Also a bit of black crush, about as little as you'll see on a VA model though. Perhaps a little bit more than some models, but certainly nowhere near as much as some VA models I've seen. So not a huge issue there. The colour reproduction, it has a lot of extension beyond the sRGB colour space. The colour gamut covers about 90% of DCI P3, and this means that the colours, when you're looking at normal sRGB content, there's extra saturation, but this is quite an even extra saturation. It doesn't look cartoonish. It doesn't have the kind of look that an Adobe RGB gamut would give, for example, nor does it have the look that digital saturation enhancements give, where you just pull shades close to the edge of the gamut. So it actually looks quite balanced, although strongly saturated, and quite a few users will actually like this and think it'll look vibrant or vivid, they describe it as, so it's quite appealing to many users. For HDR, it's also good because that targets the DCI P3 colour space. The HDR10 standard does indeed at the moment, and this actually supports VESA Display HDR 400. And as far as VESA Display HDR 400 implementations go, I actually quite like this model. It certainly had some advantages to running HDR. The tone mapping was more accurate, subtle shade variety, and in particular when looking at shadowy areas and that kind of thing, and sort of the detail in highlights as well, but much better. But it doesn't have any sort of local dimming on the backlight, so there's no contrast advantage to running it in HDR, and it doesn't deliver a true HDR experience for that reason. The responsiveness, the good old Achilles heel of VA models, and this monitor was no exception in that respect. It certainly had some sort of good aspects to the responsiveness. It worked at 144 Hz, which is nice. It has fairly low input lag, not extremely low, but pretty low, and fairly low signal delay, so that won't bother most users. The pixel responses were sort of variable. For the lighter and medium transitions, they were largely fast enough for a decent 144Hz performance, a little bit of powdery trailing in places, but nothing extreme. For the higher contrast transitions, which are where VAs have their more obvious standout weaknesses, this model did have some definite standout weaknesses, had some smeary trailing, and it had some transitions which were clearly a lot slower than optimal. And these transitions were a bit more widespread and, in terms of the weaknesses, a bit more obvious than on the Samsung C27 AG273QCX that I looked at. But I wouldn't say they were a million miles apart, to be honest. And I'd say this model is quite similar to the AOC AG273QCX. And that's a model which some users find absolutely fine for responsiveness. Other users don't like so much. But typically you'll find that there are some users who just won't tolerate any VA model, no matter how good or bad it is in terms of pixel responses. This one I'd put sort of somewhere in the middle. It's far from the worst I've seen, but it's not the best I've seen either. It supports adaptive sync and therefore supports AMD FreeSync, or specifically AMD FreeSync 2. That works properly to get rid of stuttering and tearing. There were some issues with more obvious overshoot as the frame rate decreases, and therefore the refresh rate decreases. This is common to FreeSync models. And on this monitor, the overshoot wasn't extreme, and it's not as bad as I've seen on some FreeSync models. And you can, of course, weaken the overdrive setting off a bit, perhaps using the weak setting if you're really sensitive to overshoot and you want to get rid of it as much as you can. But then you do get some more powdery trailing, some more smeary trailing in places as well, depending on the frame rate. So it's not ideal doing that. Another issue I noticed is flickering. On my AMD GPU using FreeSync, this wasn't too bad really. It kind of just occurs where there was rapid fluctuations in frame rate or sudden drops of say 30 or 40 frames a second or more, and there'd be sort of momentary flickering. I also observed it occasionally at other frame rates. It's sort of hard to pinpoint exactly the frame rate ranges where it happened, and it might have even been that this particular content I was looking at, there was just something it didn't like about that. But it wasn't really bothersome enough on my AMD GPU for me to disable the technology. It does support NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode, and I use that on my GTX 1080 Ti. Unfortunately though, the flickering here was a lot more widespread and a lot more obvious, and that actually did my head in. So I frankly didn't like using NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode because of this. Some users who aren't so sensitive to flickering, they won't mind it. Another aspect to note is that using NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode, the overdrive setting didn't do anything. No matter what I set that to, it always reacted as if it was set to off the overdrive setting, so not ideal at all. So that's really all there is to the AOC AG273QCX. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.